After establishing trading posts along the in 1624, by 1961, 14 countries in Africa were under French rule. But more than 50 years after granting its colonial empire independence, Paris still has a large presence across the continent. French economic influence is still felt by many African treasuries, and French military troops have been involved in conflicts throughout the continent. And this despite statements by both President François Hollande and his predecessor Nicolas Sarkozy declaring the era of Francophone officially over. So as the 16th Francophone Summit kicks off in Madagascar this week, what is the current state of affairs between Africa and its former French rulers? And what lies ahead for Africa's French connection? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, the annual summit of the International Organization of La Francophonie begins today in Madagascar's capital, Antananarivo, where talks will likely focus on security and development, as well as youth empowerment in French-speaking countries. But with the summit being held on African soil once again, it has highlighted the relationship between France and its former African colonies. CCTV's Robert Nagila is in Antananarivo, where he filed this report.
Friday marks Youth Day in Madagascar, a celebration of young people's talent and creativity. Outside the summit venue, people wait patiently to gain entry. Close to 30,000 visitors from French-speaking countries are expected this weekend.
C'est le 16e sommet de la francophonie.
This summit aims to boost the economic development and cultural exchange between all Francophone countries.
In many Francophone countries, especially in Africa, young people represent the majority of the population. But governments are struggling to provide enough job opportunities. This is one of the challenges youths raised during their discussions with ministers and other delegates. Other youngsters are curious to learn more about Francophone countries.
I come here today with my daughter and cousin to see what is in the village, yes, because it's about my country, so I'm interested.
I want to look at what is the beautiful of Francophonie.
Later in the day, Madagascar's president arrived to inspect the summit venue before heading off to the airport to receive arriving dignitaries. Around 60 heads of state will gather here for the official opening ceremony. From there, it will be a busy 48 hours as delegates adopt several resolutions and the leadership of the organization is passed from Senegal to Madagascar. Robert Nagila, CCTV, Antananarivo, Madagascar.
And now to offer some analysis into Africa's French connection, I have expert guests standing by in Paris. Professor Joaf Toka, he's a professor of international affairs of the American Graduate School. In London, Paul Melly, an associate fellow in the Africa program at Chatham House. And with me in Nairobi, Hans de Marie Hengup, he's a Central Africa analyst at the International Crisis Group. To you all, thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. Paul Melly in London, I'll start off with you there. Now, France's relationship with Africa has been a long and complex one, even after independence. And in fact, two French presidents have declared recently that the era of Francophone is over. What is the current relationship, though, between France and her former colonies in Africa?
Well, it's rather different from what it used to be 2 or 3 decades ago, when the phrase France-Afrique was really coined to describe the connections of vested interests between the French political elite and African leaders. Now it's a much more normalized process. It's going much more through normal intergovernment relations. There are still personal connections because a lot of the leaders in Francophone Africa studied in France, for example, so they often know people individually at the top of French politics. but it's a more formal process, and there's been an effort under President Hollande to really focus on making Africa much more of an equal partner in deciding how the relationship should go forward. So, for example, he consulted African governments before intervening in Mali, and that's something that perhaps French governments would not have done 2 or 3 decades before. But still the connection remains very close, and of course there are many Africans in France.
Professor Toka, is that your view as well? The connection is still quite strong between France and African colonies.
Yeah, the connection is strong in terms of overall mentality, let's put it, because this is the kind of discourse you hear within the French political class and within most political classes and elites over Africa. However, I would introduce some kind of nuance regarding the recent years, and I would describe those recent years in comparison to previous periods in a way which would be more hesitant and would be characterized by some kind of hesitation on the French side, and perhaps we were speaking about some kind of a transitional period, which is to say that on one hand, if we go back, say, 2 to 4 or 5 years, we have stronger French intervention in Africa in terms of military presence, and I'm referring, of course, to the fight against different organizations in Mali, in Central African Republic,
right.
etc. But on the other hand, as the international agenda is, which is being perceived by French prism, goes well beyond Africa, and there are so many problems on European soil, and you add up to that the fact that France is going through a harsh economic and social and political crisis that in a way had distanced African concerns from Parisian prism. So I wonder what's going to be happening now over the coming year, in which, as you know, there are
right.
French presidential elections in about 6 months. There's going to be a new president, most probably. I may be right in saying that some hesitation and some transitional elements are there into the picture.
Hans-Marie Dengup, you have been monitoring this, though, from Africa. What are your sentiments? Is there a transition in the relationship? What are your sentiments on this?
I do tend to agree with all the argumentation and the development of Paul Meili. So that means, of course, things have not been tough in the intervention of France in Africa, precisely in Francophone Africa, nowadays compared to the decades of the 60s, 70s, or 80s. But we still see a kind of colonial mentalism, both from France and African elites, and even within a part of African grassroots. I will just take a couple of examples. When looking, for example, at the security and military point, of course, there is no longer today operations such as Operation Barracuda in Central African Republic or Operation Turquoise in Rwanda.
Right.
But the operations, the involvement of French helicopters and French troops during the post-electoral violence in Côte d'Ivoire, who have sacked Gbagbo, is very recent, and we cannot ignore that fact. We cannot ignore also the fact that when discussing with Gabon elite, when discussing with Gabon grassroots and the civil society association, I was quite marked and struck by the fact that many of them were attending a kind of word from Paris that will decided who between Omar Bongo and Jean-Pierre has win the election. So that means in the mentality, in how people still behave on the military, on the political and diplomacy, this is still operational. Also look, for example... We'll
come to that in just a moment. But Paul, I do want to bring you in this conversation, though, because you have previously mentioned that Africa is really the only place where France is a major player, and for that reason, France cannot completely detach itself from Africa. Is that your view?
I think that is true, and it's true of France. It's also arguably true of the European Union as well, that this is the one region of the world where France is one of the 2 or 3 leading external partners. And because policy in the European Union is so important to France, and the instruments, the institutions of the EU are so important to the French government, that also, it links very closely to French policy with the EU, and in a sense we're in a curious position at the moment where basically the biggest development donor to sub-Saharan Africa, particularly to West Africa, is the European Union, and the key military partner for sub-Saharan Africa in the West, particularly in the Sahel, is France. The French aid budget has actually shrunk over the last decade or so, particularly under Mr. Sarkozy's presidency, and France doesn't yet feel it has the financial means to rebuild an aid budget which used to be much larger in real terms.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's counting on the EU, if you like, to provide that sort of financial dimension. And West Africa is really particularly the region where that's so obvious.
Right, Hans, though, does Africa really matter to France, or France matters more to Africa than Africa does to France?
I think it is balanced, and I think I still come back on the idea that I have just elaborated earlier on. For me, the mentalities are not still completely decolonized, and it's not just something from France, it's also involving African people. When, for example, you study how civil societies, pro-democracy organizations are trying to build themselves, most of them, whether we are in Cameroon, in Gabon, and Central African Republic, expect a support from Paris. They are in the expectation of Paris will do this, Paris will do that. So that means they have not yet self-centered civil society organization and thinking themselves as autonomous. And also, when looking as, despite the fact it is no longer brutal as in the past, France continue to have a kind of eyes in how African political internal affairs, especially in Francophone area, are conducted. We have seen it with the recent election in Gabon.
Right.
And when looking at the security point, yes, I do agree that currently one of the key partners of African countries when looking at Lake Chad Basin area in the fight against Boko Haram, or when looking at Sahel area against other jihadist group there, France through Operation Barkhane is playing a key role. But by the key role is also its influence that is growing. So all of these are related, and in my view, I am in a kind of in-between position saying France-Afrique is not died, but France-Afrique is no longer strong as in the past.
I'll put that question to Professor Toka there, though. Francophrique has not died, according to Hans, but it's in transition, or it's in a different format, though. Does Africa still matter to the French in as much as the French matters to Africa?
Yes, yes, both, on both sides, yes. I mean, when the question is put frontally to French leaders, to French intellectuals, to French historians, they would certainly say yes. Perhaps the more nuanced question is in which way these things are evaluating, and this is perhaps why a comparison to what the situation has been, or the way it has been perceived, say 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, could be helpful for us to see where the movement is going, if a movement there is. And in this sense, I would say that on one hand, the French has always had that kind of ambiguity, on one hand being very proud of the fact that indeed France sees itself as sort of delegated by the international community, or at least by the European community, the European Union, as the front agent, front protagonist over Africa. Now, the French are very proud of that somewhere. On the other hand, as they have to pay the price in terms of a budgetary effort and other allocations, they're less proud of it. And they're frustrated, as they feel at times, that they are alone in that sense, mainly regarding German participation. So there's kind of a balance. For example, over the last few years, we've seen the French being active militarily on the terrain and asking for the Germans to pay the money for that. And then comes the United States, of course, which also sees France in a way as, in a way, being delegated in terms of surveillance of African affairs. So you see there are some elements which indeed go back to colonial lexicolonial vocabulary, although of course do not take the form of colonial reality the way we have known it way back in the 20th century.
We'll leave it there for the moment, and we are going to take a short break, but when we return, we'll continue this discussion on Africa's French connection. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. We continue our analysis into Africa's French connection. I still have my guests standing by. Geoff Toka, Professor of International Affairs at the American Graduate School in Paris. In London, Paul Melly, Associate Fellow in the Africa Program at Chatham House. And with me in Nairobi, Hans de Marie Hengop, a Central Africa Analyst at the International Crisis Group. Hans, I'll start off with you this time because the relationship between Anglophone Africa with Britain is quite hostile, if I may use that word. But what is the relationship, though, between the Francophone countries with France?
Yeah, we can perceive that the relationship between former African colonized by France has been much more hostile. And I think this has to do with two key reasons. The first one is the way colonization has been designed and implemented in both sides of Africa. In the Anglophone side, in most of the country, there was a kind of indirect rule form of government used by the UK to colonize and to administrate the colonies. It was not the case in the Francophone. So the Francophone African countries' colonies were directly perceive and feel the domination of the French people as they were there physically in all the administrative position within the country. The second thing, it has to do also with the fact that when just looking, we see among the different Africas, Anglophone Africas or Anglophone speaking countries of Africa seem to be, economically be much more well than Francophone Africas who are like poorest than the Anglophone one. And this is creating a kind of perception within the Francophone that maybe if you have been colonized by the British, we will certainly have been much more compared to where we are. And the third element also that can complete the list is the UK doesn't involve itself so deeply in Anglophone independent countries like France is continuing doing with Francophone. I think these are among the reasons that can explain that.
Right. Professor Geoff Toka, of course, we do understand that some Francophone African countries still pay some taxes to Paris. What do we know about that?
Well, that has been sort of, the French call it a serpent de mer, which means sort of an ocean snake in the sense of every few years you have once again that debate in France and to some extent I believe in African capitals as well, that what are we going to do with this France-Afrique, with those supposedly special relations between Paris and the African continent. And there are very intelligent things said in colloquium and in academic circles, and then seemingly the political classes on both sides of the Mediterranean just keep on going their way. So there have been reforms in those traditional relations in which indeed many African leaders used to take advice in Paris, and that French ambassadors in African capitals used to be sort of a first counselor to the prime minister or to the president locally. This is no more the case in a generalized way. But when crises come up,
but isn't that Geoff, Professor?
There seems still to be some kind of thing.
Isn't that still an extension of some form of colonization, if it still exists today?
The French, of course, wouldn't say that, but if you look at it objectively and you compare it to the way, say, European or other major Western powers deal with their ex-colonies, you may say that indeed, yes, this is in a way more emphasized and more prominent than, say, the relations London may have with some of its ex-colonies. I think that on a comparative scale, yes, you may say that the French are number one on this chart in terms of maintaining and insisting and believing that indeed something special between them and the ex-colonies.
Right, there is still that special relationship with the ex-colonies. Paul Melly, though, we're looking at a changing world now, of course, with the Brexit, the exit of the UK from the European Union. And we're also looking at the president-elect in the United States and the policies on immigration. France does have an election coming up next year. With all these immigration agendas going back and forth, you know, in Europe and in America, what is it likely to be the policy regarding Africa?
Well, obviously, ultimately, it depends on the outcome of the election, because if Madame Le Pen was to get elected, it would be similar to the election of Donald Trump in the sense that all bets about the future of French policy would be off. She would be likely to adopt a much more hard line on immigration, a much more narrowly nationalistic line. But there's an aspect of the Front National policies which is about maintaining sort of France's big name, if you like. And for those reasons, she might actually remain quite friendly with some African countries, particularly ones that were regarded as old allies and partners. But it would be a very different, I think, agenda if either Mr. Fillon or Mr. Juppé is elected, or else if, although it doesn't look very likely at the moment, President Hollande or another socialist is the president after the election, because they are much more in the mainstream of the way French policy has been steered in the last 15 or 20 years, which is to try and align French policy with that of the European Union. So the relationship with Africa remains very close, but it's also trying to normalize it a bit. And I think we shouldn't forget that Mr. Juppé, for example, was one of the early instigators of the process of reforming French Africa policy back in the 1990s.
Right.
And that later France, together with Britain, co-wrote the decision to insert political governance, democracy conditions into European Union policy on Africa. So a lot will depend on the outcome of the French election. But unless Madame Le Pen wins, if any of the other candidates that one could imagine is elected president, probably the policy will continue pretty much as it is now. That's to say, a very close relationship with West Africa, where there's an understanding on governance, and a more difficult one with Central Africa.
Professor Joaf Toka, do you have a view on that, though, regarding the issue of immigration and a likely French policy going forward?
I would imagine that whoever is elected or re-elected in the most improbable situation in which Mr. Hollande would be once again president, which is really very low on probability, whoever is going to be, in terms of immigration policies, these are going to be tightened. These are going to be tightened because of whatever is happening within the French political sphere and in the context of the overall European political sphere. And this is certainly the most important single issue when we come to examine European or French overall migration and immigration policies. Don't forget that over the last 3 years, the problem is immigration towards Europe from Africa as well as from other places, but mainly from other places, maybe the Middle East and Eastern Asia. So through European eyes, through European prism, the relative importance, significance of immigration from Africa has lowered down in terms of priorities. And I believe that this will go on, whoever is going to be the next president of France, and whatever is going to happen on other regarding other dimensions of relations between France and the African continent.
Right. Hans, I'll come to you and get a final comment from everybody there, because France is no longer the only player on the continent in Africa, particularly for Francophone Africa. There are other emerging powers like China. Yeah. What impact is this having on French policy on the continent? And does France really still have a role to play in Africa?
Yes. What we have been observed is a kind of slight withdrawal of France in terms of the power that they could have in economic affairs within Francophone Africa. That doesn't mean that they are no longer a relevant or a key partner. For example, the second partner, economic partner in Cameroon, the first partner in Gabon, and in many African countries, they are still in the top 3. But the interest, economic interest with the the growing trade and the exchange with China might decrease. So I think this also need to be highlighted and mentioned.
Right. Paul Melly, do you think France, though, still has a role to play in Africa, given the emergence of other powers on the continent?
I think so, but I think increasingly it's particularly in partnership with other European countries, and it's very noticeable that Germany, for example, recently sent 650 troops to join the UN force in Mali, and in doing so said it was doing this as a gesture of support for the French role in the security in the Sahel. So that Europe dimension will matter here. And I think the involvement of powers like China and Turkey is sort of complementary to that, because they are doing economic things that France wouldn't normally do anyway. I mean, the Chinese building a lot of infrastructure, the Turks perhaps involved in trade. That doesn't really undermine the French position. It's an inevitable trend in world affairs. I think they can adjust to that, but increasingly working through the EU is going to be a key aspect for French policy, because that's the only way it can be viable going forward economically.
Right. Professor Toka?
Yes, because, you know, if you look over a 20-year period, you see that overall French commerce with the African continent has dropped dramatically. I believe that in the medium range, actually, whoever is president in France and whatever other major developments will take place in terms of immigration and overall international agenda, something will happen also on the trade growth scene, because the French start to understand. They're always somehow slower to understand that than other world powers such as Britain or China or the United States. But growth is all over the place in Africa, and the French start to understand it and start to translate that in concrete terms. I believe that regardless of security problems and pure political problems of the continent in the coming future, the French would be more sensitive and perhaps more efficient in terms of translating those growth opportunities for mutual benefit.
And we'll leave it there for the moment on the program. That's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But thank you to my guests for their insights. Joe Toka, Professor of International Affairs, American Graduate School in Paris. In London, Paul Melly, Associate Fellow in the Africa Program at Chatham House. And with me in Nairobi, Hans D. Marie Hengup, a Central Africa Analyst at the International Crisis Group. Do remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, and do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. Goodbye.